Hey guys, and welcome back for the second half of this exciting visual effects tutorial where we will be turning Bella the cat from this cute little kitten into a White Walker minion. In the last part we used Adobe After Effects to create this organic looking White Walker eye texture. In this video we are going to go a little bit more advanced and take this texture and track it onto Bella's eyes. For that, we are going to be using a tool called Mocha AE, which is a planar tracker that comes inbuilt with Adobe After Effects since, I believe, version CS3. So again, this is going to be an intermediate tutorial. I will assume that you are fairly comfortable using Adobe After Effects and that you have used or at least heard of Mocha before. If you haven't yet, or maybe you're just looking for the files to follow along with this tutorial, all of the relevant links are going to be down in the description of the video, so do make sure to check that out. But now, before I talk your ears off, let's jump right into the tutorial. Welcome to the wonderful world of Adobe After Effects, and let's pick up where we left off in the last part of this tutorial. In the last part we created this really cool looking White Walker eye texture, and if you haven't finished part 1 yet, I've included a White Walker eye.png file for you to download in the description of the video, so you can just download that and use this image instead. But now it's finally time to return to our main composition, and let's finally get to tracking Bella's face to insert this eye into it. As I've mentioned, for that we are going to be using Mocha AE, but I think I got it wrong. Mocha AE is actually included in Adobe After Effects CS4 and above. And before we start tracking, I want to come into my project panel, select this Bella closeup.mp4 and just take note of the frame rate. So it's at 29.97 frames per second. And this is always really important when you're doing tracking. If your frame rate from After Effects to your tracking program and back doesn't match, then you're going to get all sorts of weird misalignments. So 29.97 frames per second for the Bella close-up clip. Let's select the layer in our composition, come up into the main menu, and under Animation, let's select Track in Mocha AE. This is going to launch Mocha, and you are going to be asked to set up a new project. Now, I will assume that you have watched my absolute beginner tutorial on how to use Mocha. It is a very powerful planar tracker that is really, really useful if you want to create some cool visual effects. So let's just get started setting up our project. Name, Bella Closeup is fine. Just store the results somewhere on your hard drive. The frame range should already be set up from your After Effects composition. The main thing I want to make sure is that my frame rate is 29.97, which is the same as the actual footage that we want to track. So that looks all good. Let's hit OK. And let me just adjust my window so it fits into the recording area a little bit better. And before you start any tracking, it is always highly advisable to scrub through your clip to see if there's any problems that you're going to encounter potentially. So we are looking at tracking her right eye right here. So let's just scrub through. But there's no obstructions. Obviously she's moving her eyes a little bit right here, but there's nothing crazy happening now. The one thing that is going to be a little bit of a challenge is that her eye has this little highlight here, as well as a few other reflections. This might confuse Mocha since a change in texture might be interpreted as a perspective shift, but we're going to deal with that in a second. So it actually looks alright. And I think I'm actually going to start tracking from the end because her eyes are a little bit bigger and the image is a little bit sharper towards the end. Remember, you always want to track from the time and area of highest detail to the lowest detail. So let's get started here. Hold down Z and let's zoom in onto her eye a little bit. And let's just draw a mask around her actual eye. So I'm first going to create a mask or a matte for her eye to kind of blacken out her eye, and then I'm going to do a second track to actually track the movement of the side of her face so that we can place that White Walker eye nicely over it. So to get started, let's select the X-Spline tool. Let me zoom in just a little bit more, and let's draw a shape around her actual eyeball. Make this panel on the left just a little bit bigger, and let's rename this layer to Right Eye Mask. Come down into the Tracking tab, and under Motion, make sure you have Translation, Scale, Rotation, and Shear enabled. We don't really need perspective for this. Actually, I think I'm going to leave this off deliberately. Otherwise, I'm worried that this highlight might, confuse Mocha a little bit. Minimum percentage pixels used, leave that on 90%. Everything else you can kind of just leave on the default. Let's just start tracking backwards and see how this goes. Let me zoom out a little bit so I can see what is happening, and let's just keep tracking. And that is actually looking pretty good. Now I'm pretty sure we will have to do a few cleanups once tracking is done, but let's just let this run through unless the mask gets totally off track. And that turned out surprisingly well, so let's scrub through. So that's the mask tracked. Obviously it does get off a little bit here, so I kind of want to fix this up with some keyframes. Let's just go to the beginning first. Let's just reshape this mask so it fits a little bit better onto the eye itself. Let's move forward and just see how this develops. And I think it's just shifting off a little bit here. And again, just start tweaking this. And it's going to create some additional keyframes here on your timeline, those little green triangles. Obviously, that's just normal. So we just kind of need to make sure that this mask properly aligns consistently with the shape of Bella's eyeball. And you want to avoid creating keyframes right next to each other. So always try to space them out as much as you can, because the interpolation that happens between consecutive keyframes is going to make sure that this is actually a nice and smooth animation and it doesn't end up looking weird and jerky. I think I'm just going to tweak this one frame here a little bit, just bring this in a little bit closer to where I think her right eyeball is. And I'd say that actually looks pretty good. Now let's bring this mask into Adobe After Effects, and for that, in the Track tab over on the right hand side, you will find two buttons for export tracking data or exporting shape data. Now we haven't actually tracked the movement or the plane of the eye or the side of her face yet, so we're just going to use this as a mask to kind of blacken out her eye so we can nicely place that White Walker eye right in front of it. So the button I want to press is Export Shape Data. Let's press that. And the format, I'm just going to select Mocha Shape Data for AE, which if you're using Mocha AE is likely the only option you have. Make sure you've got the selected layer selected. Hit Copy to Clipboard, and let's jump back into Adobe After Effects. Back in Adobe After Effects, let's create a new solid layer, and I'm going to call this one Right Eye Mask. Make sure the color is set to black, then hit OK, and before we do anything else, do make sure that you're at the very beginning of your composition, otherwise your data is going to totally misalign. So with the cursor at the beginning of your composition, come up into the main menu, select Edit, and down in here you will find an option to paste Mocha Mask. So let's select that. And now that mask that we've created and tracked in Mocha has been applied to our solid layer. And if you scrub through, Bella's eye should be fully black. The cool thing is that on our right eye mask layer, we now have this mask, and we can kind of go in here and increase the feather for maybe 2. I just kind of want to soften the edges just that little bit. And that actually looks pretty good. Let's collapse the layer again, and now let's do the actual planar tracking on the side of Bella's face to insert that White Walker eye. Just a note that obviously a cat's eyes, or a human's for that matter, aren't actually flat, they're round. If you wanted to create an absolutely accurate eye replacement, you would actually have to 3D motion track the movement of the camera as well as the movement of the head of your actor or your cat, and create an actual 3D model for the eyeballs, texture them, and then composite them into your shot. In most instances though, you will get away with just doing a simple planar track. Just be aware that with certain movement of the head and at certain angles, the eye might feel a little bit flat and stuck on. But don't stress, for most hobby projects a planar track is going to be more than sufficient. So let's return back to Mocha AE, let's zoom out a little bit, and let's start tracking the actual plane, the side of Bella's face where we want to insert this eye. Because I don't want to accidentally retract this mask that we've just created, let's come up into our layer controls on the left hand side and disable this cogwheel here to say no longer calculate the tracking for this right eye mask. Let's go in a little bit again, and now I actually want to start tracking the side of Bella's face, right under her eyeball, just the cheek area. And if I scrub through, towards the end here, you'll see she raises her eyebrows. So in my track, I don't actually want to include this area up here because it's actually moving. I just want to use that lower area down here. And the cool thing is that in Mocha, if you already have a matte or other layers tracked, you can actually use them as a track matte to kind of cut them out of the areas you're going to track. Let me explain what I mean by that. Let's again reselect the X-Spline tool, come in a little bit, and let's draw a mask around the area we actually want to planar track. So let's draw around the side of her cheek. I don't want to go too far down, just kind of the edge here and maybe just a little bit of the side of her nose. And now you can either kind of come around the eye, but because we already have a mask for the eye, we can actually use that as a track matte. So I'm just going to actually close this mask off right down through the middle. In my layer controls, let's rename this layer to right eye track. And now, very important, let's drag this layer below the right eye's mask. And let me make this panel a little bit bigger so we can actually see the names. Mocha is going to apply every layer that sits above the one you're tracking in the stack out. So if I come up here in that little toolbar, I can actually enable my track mattes. So right now, this gray area here is the actual area that Mocha will use for tracking. If I come up into this little toolbar again, into this square over the circle icon, let's click on that and change this to selected track mattes. You will note that the matte, the actual track matte that Mocha is going to use for tracking, has this mask on top cut out. If I reorder my layers and drag this to the top, now the track matte would include that little section again, but if I drag it below my eye mask, that mask, because it is above my right eye track in the stack, is going to be cut out. So I'm really just tracking this bottom area here. Ideally, if you have a shot where you're tracking multiple things, you always want to track from the foreground into the background. So whenever you're tracking an element that is in the background, you already have track mattes created that you can just apply as long as your stack is in the right order. Now let's enable the surface tool as well as the grid. And I actually want to drag the surface over this eyeball now. Let's align the surface as best as we can with the side of Bella's face and make sure that the surface covers the entire eye that we want to replace. Let's zoom out a little bit, and that angle-wise, that doesn't actually look too bad. Let's adjust this just a little bit. Come down into the tracking options. Minimum percentage pixels used, make sure that is pretty nice and high, 90% should be good. And in the motion options, I also want to enable perspective tracking. Now, with everything set up, let's start tracking backward first. And the reason I want to show this grid is just so you can kind of see what is happening. I want to make sure that this stays nicely attached to the side of Bella's face. And so far that is actually looking like a really nice and solid track. I'm going to speed this up a little bit and let it track through just so you don't have to sit there and wait for it. Cool, that looked pretty good. Let's scrub through. And yeah, that's staying really nice and well attached to the side of Bella's face. Let's come back to our initial keyframe and let's track the rest forward. And we're coming up to the point where Bella is going to raise her eyebrow. And I just want to make sure that, yep, the plane stays nicely attached to the side of her face. That's tracking really nice. It's going to come out great. Cool. And tracking is done. And if you now scrub through the whole clip, you can see that that plane stays really nicely attached to the side of Bella's face. And we're now ready to actually insert the White Walker eye. For that, let's come down to the bottom right. And this time I'm going to select Export Tracking Data because I actually want to export this tracked surface as a corner pin. So let's select Export Tracking Data. And the format, I'm going to select After Effects Corner Pin supports motion blur. Let's hit Copy to Clipboard and let's jump back to Adobe After Effects. In our composition, let's create a new solid. I'm going to call this one White Walker Eye Right. Hit OK. Again, make sure you're at the very beginning of your composition and you have the White Walker Eye Right layer selected. And then press Ctrl V to paste the data from Mocha AE straight onto this solid. If you now come into the effects controls, you will see that this has applied a corner pin to this layer. And if you scrub through, you should see that this layer really nicely tracks onto the side of Bella's face. Obviously, it isn't really much of a White Walker eye. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the White Walker Eye Right layer, press Ctrl-Shift-C to pre-compose it. I'm going to call this layer White Walker Eye Right Comp. Make sure you leave all attributes in this composition and hit OK. Now let's double click this composition to jump into it, and anything we place in this composition will essentially be placed on top of Bella's eye. Fortunately, we already created a cool looking texture for a White Walker eye, so let's return to our project panel, and you can either use the White Walker eye composition if you followed part 1, otherwise you can simply grab this White Walker eye PNG and just drop it right into the composition. And maybe I'm going to scale this up just a little bit, maybe to 115%. And now if I return to the tutorial composition, you can see that the eye, well, it's way too small, but we can deal with that in a moment, is actually tracked really nicely onto Bella's face. Obviously, there's still a number of things wrong with it. For one, it's kind of a little bit too small, so let's jump back into the White Walker right eye comp. I'm actually going to scale this layer up a fair bit. That's probably not too bad. Let's jump back to our tutorial composition. And yeah, that seems to be sitting a little bit better. But now I also want to make sure that, well, I don't want to see this weird square, but the cool thing is we already have a mask that we can now use as a track matte onto this White Walker eye to kind of cut it out and place only the part that we want in Bella's face. And for that, all we have to do is select our right eye mask layer, duplicate it, drag it to the very top, so just above the White Walker right eye comp layer, and let's rename this layer to right eye matte. And let's change the track matte on our White Walker right eye comp layer from none over to alpha matte. And now the eye is placed right in Bella's face. Obviously, it still looks a little bit weird. It's still not quite there. So there are a few more tweaks that we have to do to make this sit really nicely in our shot. And the first thing is just the placement and the scale of this eye. Obviously, you can always jump back into the White Walker right eye comp and start moving this around, rotating it and scaling it until it fits really nicely. But there's actually a much easier way to do this. So let's return to our cat composition. Let's go into our effects and presets panel and let's search for the transform effect. You will find this effect under distort. So let's apply the transform effect to the White Walker right eye comp layer. Let me zoom in a little bit so we can see a little bit better what we're going to do. And the great thing is that I can now move the position or the scale and rotate it around and kind of place Bella's eye exactly the way I want in her face. If you want a little bit more control, you can also disable uniform scale, and then you can kind of scale the height and the width separately. So I might just push that out a little bit just to give her pupil a little bit more space in her eye. So that actually looks pretty cool. Let's scrub through. Yep, that's not bad. Now, here at the end, Bella's eyeballs are actually moving, but the texture obviously isn't really following along. So what I might do, I might actually animate some of these properties. So let's come to where she's about to raise her eyebrows to maybe about there. I'm going to place a keyframe on the position as well as on the rotation. Let's move forward just a little bit to about there where her eye should probably have moved. And let's just rotate this a tiny bit more. And I'm also going to move this up and to the left a little bit. So now she's kind of moving her eye right there. And you can kind of play with this and tweak this to kind of match exactly the movement of the eyes of your actor or your pet. That actually looks pretty good, but I do want to add a little bit more shape, a little bit of shading to this eye, so it kind of gets a little bit darker on the outer edge. And you can play with this right eye matte and the right eye mask below, which defines the black that sits underneath this eye. But I found that that was a little bit fiddly, and there's actually another way to get a little bit more control. Let's reselect the White Walker right eye comp layer. Let's temporarily disable the transform as well as the corner pin effects. And let's change the track matte from alpha back to no track matte. So we should see the full eye right here. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to come up into my tools and select the ellipse tool. I'm going to draw a mask right in the middle of this eye. Hold down Control. So we're kind of staying centered. Just pull this out to maybe about there. And I'm going to expand the mask and just kind of feather this out quite a bit. Let's reapply the corner pin and let's reapply the transform. Let's also change the track matte back to alpha matte, and let's kind of come in. And the cool thing is that now I can actually use this mask and kind of shape this mask to kind of push in on the outside, on the sides, and kind of define exactly how much darkness I want around the outside of this eye. And I can really tweak this very, very fine to kind of make this sit exactly the way I want to, and I don't have to fiddle with all of these different mattes and masks in my composition. So this is making a huge difference, just kind of adding that shape and making it look a little bit more rounded. And just making it look a whole lot more rounded. Let's rewind our composition and let's play back what we have so far. And I'd say that actually looks pretty cool. Now, one last thing I want to do, let's solo the Bella close-up layer for a moment, is I actually do want this little highlight on top of the eye because it adds so much to the liveliness. It just adds so much to an eye. If you don't have reflections in an eye, it just looks really flat and weird. So I definitely want to at least add this little highlight back on top. And we're going to use a really simple 2D motion track to do that because it's so distinct, it's so easy to track. So let's come to the beginning of the composition, come up into Window, and let's bring up our tracker controls. Make sure the Bella close-up layer is selected, and let's simply select Track Motion. Let's zoom in a little bit and place this track point right exactly on the highlight for her eye. Let me just bring this up a little bit so we can see all of our tracker controls, and let's simply analyze forward. This should go nice and quick, and you shouldn't have any issues because this is actually a really nice and easy track. So that looks perfect. Let's create a new null object, and this layer I'm going to call Highlight Track Right. And back in our tracker controls, let's select Edit Target and make sure that we select our Highlight Track Right null object as the target for our motion data. Hit OK. Let's hit Apply, and yes, X and Y please. So now we have a null object tracked to the highlight of Bella's eye. And now I'm going to select and duplicate this Bella close-up layer. Zoom in a little bit, select the ellipse tool, and let's draw a mask around this little highlight here. And I've actually just unsoloed the layer at the bottom, so all we really have is this little highlight. Maybe with the layer selected, press MM to bring up the mask path properties. So let's just feather this out just a little bit. Just to avoid confusion, let's also rename this layer to Highlight Right. And very important, because this is an actual video, I want to freeze this frame right here where we've got this highlight placed right where the null object is. So let's right click this layer, come up into Time and select Freeze Frame. And the very last thing to do is to parent our Highlight Right layer to the Highlight Track Right null object so that it'll kind of just follow along with the movement of this null object. And now if we unsolo all of our layers, obviously the highlight is vanishing behind the eye, so let's bring it all the way to the top, and we don't actually want it to be dark, so I'm going to change the blend mode from normal over to add, and let's hide that null object so we don't need to see it. And now if we scrub through, we've kind of re-added this really organic looking highlight from Bella's eye over our White Walker eye, and it's adding a huge amount of realism. It just looks so much better just with that really tiny detail. Now that we have finished replacing Bella's right eye, let's repeat the entire process for her left eye. But to spare you the pain of having to watch me go through this entire thing again, I have already completed that. I've just hidden my layers in my composition, so let me just unhide all of my layers and re-enable the visibility on my left eye mask, which blacks out the eye, the White Walker eye itself, and the actual highlight. And you may notice that you don't actually see the highlight all of the time, because in the base footage, what actually happens, let me just solo this Bella close-up layer just for a second. You may notice that when you're tracking this highlight on the left eye, it vanishes for a short moment and then kind of comes back due to the angle of the light to her eye. So what I've actually done, let's unsolo that again. What I've done on this layer for the left highlight, I've actually animated the opacity to kind of fade out and fade back in to match up with the original footage. But other than that, the process for replacing this left eye was exactly the same as for the right eye, so I'm not going to go through all of that again. Instead, let us collapse all of our layers. Let's rewind, zoom back out, and let's actually check out what we've got so far. And that is looking pretty cool. The last two things I want to do is, for one, I want to apply a bit of color grading to kind of stylize this clip a little bit more, make it look a little bit more dark, a little bit more Games of Thronesy. And the other thing I want to do is kind of add a little bit of glow to her eyes, just so they stand out in this clip a little bit stronger. Now, because we have track mats placed over our White Walker eyes, we can't apply a glow effect to the eye itself, because otherwise it's going to be actually cut off by this track mat. We actually need to pre-compose it, but because we're going to apply the same treatment to both eyes, I'm actually going to pre-compose everything for the eyes together. So let me actually grab everything for the left eye as well as everything for the right eye. I may as well pre-compose the null objects as well. So everything except for our base footage, Ctrl-Shift-C to pre-compose it. I'm going to call this composition White Walker Eyes Comp and hit OK. Let me zoom back out, and let's start by applying some color grading first. For that, I'm going to create a new adjustment layer. I'm going to rename this to color grading. And I've covered this in many of my tutorials before. You can use any type of color adjustment or curves effect to tweak the color of your footage in any way you like. One effect that I personally really like to use ever since it's been brought into Adobe After Effects is the Lumetri color effect. So I'm just going to apply the Lumetri color effect to my color grading adjustment layer, come into the Creative tab, because it's got some really nice presets that are just easy and fun to use. Let's expand the looks. And the one I'm going to pick is SL Bleach NDR. So let's just select this look, and that's going to give me a really nice and dark, contrasty, fairly desaturated look that looks a little bit Games of Thronesy. What I might actually do, expand this basic correction, maybe just bring the highlights down a little. I want this to be a little bit, just a little bit darker. Maybe push up the contrast a little bit as well. So just kind of get this really nice dark look. And now we just need to make her eyes stand out, because obviously the eyes are being affected by this color grading as well. And I might actually drag these eyes above the color grading so they already stand out a little bit more. Yes, usually I like to apply color grading to all of my layers, but in this case I really just want the eyes to stand out a bit stronger. So maybe I'll just leave that above the color grading. And now come back into your Effects and Presets panel and let's search for the glow effect. Under Stylize, let's apply the glow effect. I want to bring the glow threshold down a fair bit and increase the radius. And again, every time you're working with glow, let's come back into the project settings and make sure our project is set to 32 bits per channel. Come back to our effects controls. And I'm just going to tweak this glow effect a little bit, jack up the radius, maybe make that a little bit more intense as well. And again, tweak this in any way you like so it looks exactly the way that you personally want it to look. Finally, the last thing I might do, I might want to apply a curves effect. Just kind of brighten this up a little bit and just add a little bit more contrast. I think I just want them to kind of pop out a little bit more intensely and kind of really stare down into the eyes of a White Walker. So that's actually pretty cool. I think I'm pretty happy with this. So now the last thing we need to do, let me make this just a little bit bigger. Let's rewind our composition and play back our final Bella the Ice Cat effect. And that's all there is to it. Obviously, you can use the very same technique to replace eyes for anyone or any of your favorite pets with any texture or image that you can think of. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you did, I would greatly appreciate it if you could give it a thumbs up, favorite it, and share it with the world. If you do want to see some more cool filmmaking and visual effects tutorials just like this one and you're new here, please consider subscribing. And as always, if you do have any comments, questions or suggestions, just leave them down in the section below. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, I will see you later.